If history were a grand stage play, then sometimes the greatest role does not belong to emperors seated upon their thrones, but to a slave, bound in chains. His name echoes across 2,000 years, Spartacus. A name without a palace, without a dynasty, without chronicles to tell his life in full. Only shadows remain, empty silences in the records, and one haunting memory, that there was once a time when a single slave made all of Rome tremble. Picture it. Rome in the 1st century BC, an empire swelling with wealth and power, yet standing on a fragile foundation built from the bones and blood of millions of slaves. A war machine like no other, but one held together by those stripped of freedom. And from within that machine came a crack, small at first, breaking open in a gladiator school at Capua. The crack spread like an earthquake, threatening to bring down the entire empire. The story of Spartacus is not merely a tale of a slave revolt. It is a bloody symphony of despair and hope, of Roman cruelty and the undying hunger for freedom. A story so powerful that even his Roman enemies could not ignore it, leaving behind brief but reverent lines in their histories. And today, we step into that darkness, where a slave transformed the longing for freedom into a fire that swept across southern Italy, shaking the heart of Rome itself. Spartacus does not step into history as a figure carefully recorded in chronicles, but as a shadow flickering across the vast blank spaces of the past. What we know of him is like faint charcoal lines sketched on the edge of a colossal canvas, a blurred silhouette drifting in the fog of time. And here lies the paradox. He became a legend, but a legend born from absence. The less we know, the easier it is to imagine, to romanticize. And it is precisely this ambiguity that allows Spartacus to endure as a symbol, a man whom history keeps rewriting, reshaping, and breathing life into, according to the needs of each passing age. He was likely born sometime between 105 and 100 BCE, when the Roman Republic stood at the height of its power, yet was riddled with fractures within. His birthplace is thought to have been Thrace, a rugged land stretched between modern-day Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Thrace was no Athens with its glittering culture, nor Sparta with its iron discipline. It was a borderland, a harsh landscape of mountains, forests, and wild steppes, where life was hard, but the people were famed for their strength and ferocity. To the Greeks and Romans, Thracian tribes were at once the stuff of heroic warrior tales, and at the same time dismissed as barbarians, lingering at the edge of civilization. Spartacus grew up in such a world, where war and violence were part of the air one breathed. Thracian tribes had long been battered by neighbors, Persians in earlier times, then Macedonians, and eventually the Romans. Their history was drenched in blood, and Thracian men grew up with sword and spear at hand, destined sooner or later to become soldiers, mercenaries, or captives. In that setting, it is not difficult to imagine Spartacus first as a warrior, before he ever fell into chains. Some scattered Roman accounts suggest he once took up arms against Rome itself in a Thracian campaign, and that his defeat in such battles may have led to his capture and eventual sale, like so much human merchandise. Yet Spartacus's life before bondage is veiled in darkness. Whether he had a family, who his parents were, or which tribe he truly belonged to, all of this remains unanswered. What is certain is that his name struck Roman ears as unusual, resonating strangely, and later historians compared it to the royal dynasty of the Bosporan kingdom near the Black Sea, where several kings bore the name Spartacus or Spartokos. From this coincidence, a romantic notion emerged that Spartacus might have carried royal blood, a chained prince cast down from a throne into slavery, from glory into disgrace. The idea of noble lineage is likely fantasy, but it added fuel to the legend. The image of a man born to greatness, humiliated beyond measure, and then rising in rebellion against an empire was far too compelling to be ignored. It felt like a Greek tragedy staged in reality, where the hero's fate was not sealed by the gods, but by human injustice and cruelty. The Thracians were famed as fierce warriors, often hired by Greek and Roman powers as mercenaries. Hardened by their harsh environment, they were skilled in mountain fighting, adept horsemen, and wielders of crude but deadly weapons. From this tradition, Spartacus is described as a man of immense strength and presence, carrying within him the aura of a natural leader. A few stray anecdotes claim that in his youth, a Thracian priestess foretold his destiny, that he would hold great power, yet meet a tragic end. Whether true or not, such stories cloaked him with the air of fate. What truly set Spartacus apart, however, was not only his strength, but his mind. Plutarch, the Greek historian, wrote that Spartacus possessed intelligence and wisdom far beyond what one might expect from a slave, even resembling a Greek in character, cultured, rational, thoughtful. For the Romans, such words were a rare admission that their enemy was not merely a barbarian, but a leader of true substance. From these scattered fragments, a picture emerges, though still hazy. Spartacus may have been a prisoner of war, a rebellious fighter, or even, though less likely, a man of noble descent. What we can say with certainty is that he was born on the fringes of Rome's world, swept into its machinery of conquest and war, and crushed into the vast system of slavery that fueled the Republic. From there, his fate became bound to chains, but it was those very chains that forged his sword of rebellion. And perhaps it is this uncertainty that makes him most captivating. Spartacus became a mirror, reflecting whatever each age most desired to see. In the 19th century, he was the emblem of class struggle. In the 20th, he was a banner for communists and revolutionaries. In Hollywood, he became the immortal rebel hero standing against oppression. Yet if we go back to the 1st century BCE, he was simply a Thracian man, chained, stripped of everything but his will to survive and his hunger for freedom. Spartacus steps out of that darkness, not complete, not clear, but enough to astonish. A slave, a foreigner, a nameless figure, and yet he carved his mark upon human history. To understand him, we must accept that all we have are fragments pieced together from biased Roman accounts and half-remembered tales. But sometimes it is the gaps in history that spark the fiercest curiosity. And it is from those very gaps that Spartacus emerges like a ghost, both distant and familiar, dim and brilliant. The less we know, the more we long to know. The more mysterious he is, the more eternal he becomes. And so, if we wish to uncover who Spartacus truly was, there is no choice but to return to those fragments. The scattered lines in Roman historians, the half-legendary stories, the shards left behind like ruins after a fire, from which we must attempt to reconstruct the whole, monumental figure of a man who rose from slavery to defy an empire. When we search for Spartacus in the pages of ancient history, the first thing we encounter is not a clear portrait of a man, but an absence. What survives are fragments, broken shards of glass, reflecting distorted and incomplete images, each one coming from a Roman or Greco-Roman writer, writing centuries after Spartacus had already fallen. And it is within this absence that a paradox emerges. The man is remembered, even celebrated, yet his story has been told almost entirely by those who stood on the opposite side of the battlefield, men who watched the slave uprising collapse and who had every reason to shape, distort, and turn the rebel into a mere figure within Rome's own tragic drama. The names that surface again and again when we follow Spartacus's faint trail are Plutarch, Appian, Florus, and Sallust. But it is worth remembering, none of them ever met him. None of them lived beside him, and most wrote when the rebellion was already a distant memory. Plutarch, the famous biographer of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, more than 200 years after Spartacus's death, left us the most detailed account. Yet, Plutarch did not write a biography of Spartacus. He wrote about Crassus, the Roman general dispatched to crush the uprising. Spartacus appears only as the shadowed adversary, the foil against which Crassus shines. Without Crassus, Plutarch would likely never have mentioned him, and our fragments today would be even fewer. Appian, a Greco-Roman historian of the 2nd century CE, also wrote about the uprising in his monumental Roman civil wars. For him, Spartacus appeared less as an individual and more as a social phenomenon, a storm of slaves threatening the very existence of the Republic. Florus, writing around the same period, left only brief passages, painting the revolt in grand, almost literary strokes, more rhetoric than history. Sallust, the only one of these authors who lived closest to Spartacus's time, left even less. Most of his works have been lost, and what remains are a handful of scattered lines. And yet, those fragments, tiny as they are precious, because they bear the faint imprint of someone who lived in the same century, breathing the same Roman air, listening to whispers still hot from the mouths of eyewitnesses. The striking fact is that every one of these voices belonged to the victors. Rome, with its vast political, military, and cultural machinery, controlled the narrative from beginning to end. Spartacus left behind no journals, no speeches, no disciples who preserved his words as Plato did for Socrates, or as Caesar did for himself in his commentaries. Spartacus survives only through the words of his enemies. And here we confront the eternal problem of history. It is rarely written by the defeated. When we read Plutarch, we must remember he was a Greco-Roman intellectual, steeped in prejudices about the barbarians of the north and east. When we read Appian, we must recognize that he wrote to justify Rome's righteousness in the face of social upheaval. When we read Florus, it becomes clear he loved exaggeration, turning Spartacus into a theatrical figure rather than a flesh and blood leader. And when we read Sallust, what strikes us most is the immense silence, the lost works that once might have told us more, so that what survives feels like a handful of scattered stones from what was once a great city. Nor does archaeology help us much. There is no grave that can be identified as Spartacus's, no artifact that bears his name. What we have instead are a few indirect traces: slave camps in southern Italy, the hurried walls thrown up by Crassus's army to trap the rebels, the hop fragments of pottery, the ruins of the gladiatorial school at Capua. These give us context, but reveal almost nothing about the man himself. So, who was Spartacus, truly? In the face of such gaps, the only path left is to read between the lines, searching for the small details the Roman historians let slip. Plutarch, for example, described him not only as strong but also intelligent, possessing the qualities of a Greek, meaning that even in the eyes of his enemies, Spartacus was not simply a brute swinging a sword in blind fury. Appian tells us he had fought against Rome before being enslaved, a detail that suggests he had military experience long before his revolt, that he was not merely a random slave who rose up by chance. These scattered details, fragile and easily overlooked, can be pieced together to reveal the outline of a living man, not just a symbol. Yet truth remains buried beneath layers of bias. For Rome, portraying Spartacus as nothing more than a barbarian slave carried a clear political purpose. To admit that an outsider, a man without pedigree, could challenge the might of the Republic was to admit the fragility of the system itself. And yet, ironically, in their efforts to diminish him, the Romans ensured his survival. By writing about him, albeit as a foil to glorify Crassus, Pompey, or other generals, they preserved his name, unwillingly preventing his erasure. The Spartacus we glimpse in these sources is thus a painting repainted many times, each layer altering the figure beneath, none complete. In Plutarch, he is the formidable opponent of Crassus. In Appian, he is the storm of slaves that threatened Rome. In Florus, he becomes a tragic hero. In Sallust, he flickers like a shadow across history's stage. No single account offers a full portrait, but together their patchwork makes Spartacus an eternal enigma. And perhaps this is precisely why he endures so powerfully in human imagination. If we knew exactly who he was, what he did day by day, Spartacus might have remained only another historical figure, bound to the context of the 1st century BCE. But because we do not know, he becomes a blank mirror, reflecting the desires, fears, and ideals of every age. For Rome, he was a warning about the dangers of the oppressed. For later revolutionaries, he became a symbol of resistance against injustice. For us today, he remains a question without an answer. Was he a man of flesh and blood, or a ghost painted by history? We stand before a handful of words and an ocean of silence. Yet it is within that silence that Spartacus emerges, as a figure who cannot be contained by time. From fragments, we begin to see the shape of a man, stripped of freedom but never bowed, a man who rose from slavery to leadership and turned the Italian peninsula into a battlefield for the dream of freedom. If there is one thing that defined the life of Spartacus, it was the brutal transformation from warrior to commodity. After suffering some defeat in his native Thrace, he was captured, shackled like an animal, and marched along Rome's stone-paved roads to the slave markets, where human beings were sold alongside cattle. We do not know exactly how that fateful day unfolded, but it was surely the turning point when a man of strength and a will to fight was forced to bow before chains. Rome in the 1st century BCE was a devouring empire, and slaves were the fuel that kept its colossal machine running. A slave might become a craftsman, a servant, a teacher, even a physician if trained, but more often they were condemned to backbreaking labor, grinding mills, digging mines, carving roads, and raising the monuments Rome so proudly displayed. Among them, however, there was a special class selected for the ludus, the training schools that bred gladiators, men destined to gamble their lives as entertainment for the masses. Spartacus became one of them. The Romans had a word for this kind of entertainment: ludi, games. But these were games of blood and sand, staged deaths performed as theater. The men who fought them were called gladiators, from gladius, the short Roman sword. It was a perilous role, despised as the lowest of the low, treated as property, yet paradoxically capable of bringing fame, admiration, even freedom. A gladiator who won enough victories could become a hero of the crowd, his name echoing through the city, and with fortune on his side, he might one day be granted a rudis, a wooden sword that symbolized liberation from slavery. That cruel contradiction made gladiators the dark stars of antiquity, both reviled and celebrated, living always one heartbeat away from death, yet grasping at the faint chance of escape. Spartacus was sent to the gladiator school at Capua, near modern Naples, not far from Rome itself. Capua was infamous as the greatest gladiatorial training ground in Italy, a place where men were reshaped into killing instruments for the amusement of audiences. There, Spartacus was trained to fight as a Gaul, a gladiator armed with a large rectangular shield and a gladius, meant to mimic Rome's ancestral enemies, the northern tribes. It was a carefully staged irony. Romans loved to see their old foes reimagined in the arena, to watch them defeated and humiliated once again, affirming Rome's dominance. Thus, Spartacus, a Thracian warrior, was forced into the costume of a Gaul, compelled to reenact an eternal defeat for Roman pleasure. Inside the walls of the ludus, life for a gladiator differed sharply from that of most slaves. They were fed generously, for their strength was the investment of their masters. Their diets were heavy with grain, earning them the nickname barley eaters. Their bodies built heavy and muscular. They were drilled mercilessly, practicing thrusts, strikes, and parries each day on sand. At night, they slept in crowded cells, living beside death, for at any moment they might be called to the arena, where a single mistake meant the end. The gladiators' world was one of paradox. On the one hand, they could be idolized like celebrities, worshipped by crowds, sometimes even desired by noblewomen willing to pay dearly for their company. On the other hand, they remained despised, without freedom, without rights, condemned to short lives. Whatever fame they gained was as fleeting as lightning in a storm, brilliant for a moment, only to vanish. In such a world, Spartacus must have felt the sharpest irony of fate. Once a free warrior of Thrace, he was now reduced to a puppet in a Roman theater of death. His old skills were not lost. If anything, they were owned sharper under the harsh regimen. But the difference was profound. No longer did he fight for his tribe or for freedom, but for the cheers of strangers, for one more day of survival. The Romans called it a profession, but in truth, it was a prison of brick walls, a delayed execution, a place where slaves were forced to turn dying into art. It was perhaps within those walls that Spartacus began to dream of escape, not just for himself, but of striking against the very system that had turned human beings into tools of blood. One can imagine the mornings at Capua, sunlight spilling across the training yard, Spartacus and his companions swinging their swords under the stern eyes of instructors. The clash of metal, the shouts, the crack of whips, all resounding like a grim symphony. They did not train to become warriors of a cause, but obedient performers of slaughter. Yet Spartacus was not easily broken. In his eyes, perhaps, there already flickered a different light, the light of a man who knew that chains only hold power if one accepts them. Fragments of Plutarch suggest that Spartacus commanded the respect of his fellow fighters, regarded as a man of vision and intelligence. He was not merely strong, but capable of organizing, inspiring, and leading others. That quality marked him not just as a gladiator, but as a leader in waiting, a man whom fate had not yet fully revealed. Within the oppressive walls of the Capua Ludus, Spartacus learned perhaps his greatest lesson. Violence only has meaning when directed at the right target. In the arena, he was forced to kill for sport. But beyond those walls, with weapons in hand and comrades at his side, violence could become a tool to shatter chains. The idea was faint, still only a shadow, but it began to take root among men caged together, trained as beasts, yet still burning with the hunger for freedom. From that soil of blood and sweat, the spark of one of Rome's greatest uprisings began to grow. A gladiator was no longer just a role in the arena, but the seed of a storm that would shake all of Italy. And so the great question emerges. How could a revolt led by a single enslaved gladiator at Capua grow into a movement powerful enough to make Rome tremble? The answer lies not only in Spartacus himself, but in the decaying foundations of the Republic, in the crisis, corruption, and greed that hollowed out Roman society. To see how one small fire became an inferno, we must look closely at the troubled world of the late Roman Republic. To understand why a small band of gladiators in Capua could spark a tremor that shook the very foundations of Rome, we have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Rome in the 1st century BCE was not only an undefeated superpower, it was also a sickly giant, a war machine both mighty and fractured. Behind the dazzling victories in the East, behind the legions parading triumphantly through the arches of Rome, lay a society tense, unstable, and riddled with contradictions. The Republic was in a prolonged crisis. Civil wars raged endlessly between rival political factions, between nobles and ambitious military strongmen, fracturing the very system that once held Rome together. Only a few decades before Spartacus, Rome had already been drenched in blood during the brutal conflict between Marius and Sulla, where tens of thousands perished and the city was torn apart by purges and confiscations. Those wounds had barely begun to scar when new waves of turmoil struck, making the Republic, always precariously balanced, totter closer to collapse. But perhaps the deeper cause lay in social injustice. While Rome's generals and governors plundered gold, land, and treasures from conquered provinces, ordinary citizens, especially the small farmers, sank deeper into misery. Forced off their land by the rise of vast estates, the latifundia, run by cheap slave labor, these farmers, once the backbone of Rome's armies, now found themselves dispossessed. They drifted into the city, dependent on grain handouts, or swelled the ranks of the restless crowds ready to be used in political riots. Here lies the heart of the matter: slavery. Rome was an empire built on chains. Every conquest brought in tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of captives. These were not just laborers, they were living trophies, the spoils of war made flesh. They were sold in markets, parceled out to wealthy families, dispatched to toil in the fields, or locked into gladiatorial schools. By the 1st century BCE, slaves are estimated to have made up as much as 1/5 of Rome's population. That sheer proportion turned the entire society into a powder keg. The Romans knew it. They knew they were living on top of a bomb, because before Spartacus, that bomb had already gone off twice, in Sicily. The great island, fertile and rich, had long been Rome's breadbasket, but in the 2nd century BCE, it became the stage for massive slave uprisings. The first, in 135 BCE, was led by a self-proclaimed prophet named Eunice, who rallied tens of thousands and carved out a slave kingdom that lasted for years. A few decades later, a second great revolt erupted there, once again forcing Rome to pour immense resources into crushing it. These two uprisings were a clear warning. Slaves were not mute tools. They could organize, they could fight, and in sufficient numbers, they could shake the empire to its core. Yet Rome ignored the lesson. It continued to depend more and more heavily on slave labor because it was cheap, exploitable, and it kept the wealth of the elite flowing. A single Roman master could own dozens, even hundreds of slaves. Across Italy, sprawling estates became fortresses of exploitation, where human beings were reduced to voiceless machines of production. In this climate, Spartacus and his companions in Capua were but a small fragment of the whole, yet within them burned the potential to become the spark. When 1/5 of the population lived in bondage, when Sicily's uprising still haunted memory, any escape attempt could flare into a movement. Any small blaze could become a firestorm. Picture Rome at that time, a golden city built upon smoldering ashes. Senators debated power, war, and ambition under the marble vaults. But outside, millions of slaves lived in resentment. Thousands of displaced farmers languished in poverty, and the streets teetered on the edge of eruption. Rome wore the armor of a mighty empire, but inside, its body was rotting. Spartacus appeared just as that social bomb was waiting to be lit. He was not the first, nor would he be the last, but he was the one whom time and circumstance chose to become a symbol. A slave, a gladiator, but armed with intelligence, strength, and a will for freedom, he became the spark that set Italy ablaze. And that fire began in Capua in 73 BCE, when Spartacus and his fellow captives decided they had endured enough chains, enough whips, enough blood spilled in the sand. It was the moment a handful of desperate men became an army, the moment staged games turned into real war. Rome's bomb had finally found its fuse. One summer night in 73 BC, behind the heavily guarded walls of the Gladiator school in Capua, a small group of fighters whispered about something no one dared to even imagine. They no longer wanted to die to the roar of the crowd, no longer wanted to be forced into bloody theater for Roman amusement. They wanted to choose their own fate, even if the price was their lives. Years of resentment, the despair of men who knew each passing day only brought them closer to death in the arena, finally fused into one desperate plan. Only 78 out of the hundreds of gladiators in Capua dared to take part in that gamble. It was a pitiful number when weighed against the might of Rome, almost laughably small. Yet among them were Spartacus, Crixus, and Oenomas, names that would soon thunder across the Italian peninsula. They were not just strong fighters, but natural leaders, men who could ignite courage in others when all seemed lost. The plan was clumsy from the start. They had intended to raid the school's armory, but the plot was uncovered, forcing them to rush into the streets with nothing more than kitchen knives, sticks, and scraps of iron seized from the workshops. It was chaos, a breakout so ragged that any outside observer would have dismissed it as doomed to collapse within days. But in that chaos, a spark was lit. Escaping Capua, the fugitives quickly seized real weapons, not with clever intrigue, but with reckless boldness. Once swords and shields were in their hands, the transformation was immediate. They were no longer pitiful slaves forced to mimic warriors in the sand, but warriors in their own right, armed like the very soldiers they had once been made to imitate. But weapons alone were not enough. What they needed most was a refuge, a stronghold from which to resist the inevitable Roman pursuit. They found it on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, the great volcano towering over the Bay of Naples, a rugged, treacherous landscape that Romans rarely dared to tread. There, on the crags and cliffs, Spartacus and his followers built a camp, turning nature itself into their fortress, turning hiding into defiance. Rome, of course, could not ignore them. When news of the escape reached the capital, the Senate dismissed it as little more than a minor disturbance. A handful of runaway slaves, however dangerous, could hardly compare to the armies Rome was used to facing. They sent a low-ranking commander with a few thousand soldiers to stamp out what they called slave uprising. That man was Claudius Glaber. His strategy was simple: block the paths down the mountain and starve the rebels into surrender. But Glaber had gravely underestimated his enemy. Spartacus, Crixus, and Oenomas were not just seasoned fighters. They knew how to use terrain, surprise, and cunning. Twisting vines and ropes from plants, they secretly scaled down a cliff face so sheer the Romans believed it impassable, then struck Glaber's camp from behind. The sudden attack turned his force into a panicked mob. Soldiers were cut down before they could understand what was happening. Their camp was plundered of weapons and supplies, and the survivors fled in terror. What was meant to be a swift end to a rebellion instead became its launching point. Word of the victory spread quickly. Slaves, impoverished farmers, even outcasts on the margins of society began flocking to Vesuvius. To them, Spartacus was no longer just an escaped gladiator, but a leader who could show them the path to freedom. Each passing day swelled the camp's numbers, from dozens to hundreds, from hundreds to thousands. The Senate grew uneasy, but still dismissed the threat as a nuisance, unworthy of sending full legions. They dispatched another commander, Publius Varinius, with his lieutenants Furius and Cassinius, to finish what they still considered a joke. But Spartacus was no joke. One by one, the Roman detachments were destroyed. Furius fell, Cassinius fell, and Varinius himself narrowly escaped capture. Defeat after humiliating defeat left Rome in shock. Slaves, the lowest of the low, the dregs of society, were humiliating the very armies that had once conquered the Mediterranean. That was the turning point. What began as a desperate flight had become a wildfire that now directly challenged Roman authority. Spartacus had shown himself to be more than a brave fighter. He was a strategist of rare brilliance. He knew he could not defeat Rome in open battle, so he exploited every weakness, every blunder, turning landscapes into weapons and surprise into an ally. More than anything, he transformed despair into hope, an invisible force powerful enough to drive thousands to risk everything at his side. Rome still did not grasp the disaster looming before it. They told themselves these were mere skirmishes, lucky strikes against careless officers. But while Rome mocked, the fire on Vesuvius spread across southern Italy. From a ragged band of runaway gladiators, Spartacus and his comrades had become the leaders of an uprising, an army in its own right, growing stronger every day. And from this point forward, the story was no longer about a few dozen desperate fugitives. It was about tens of thousands of slaves, peasants, and outcasts rising together. A storm was gathering, and mighty Rome was about to face a trial it had never imagined. A war not against foreign foes, but against the very people it had long treated as tools of its empire. From a ragtag band of fugitives, Spartacus's followers swelled into a flood that swept across southern Italy. Each victory over Roman troops rang out like a thunderclap, a call to arms proclaiming that those once shackled in chains had now risen and were striking down their former masters. Slaves fled the estates to join them. Impoverished farmers rallied to their side. Even outlaws and brigands came running. What had begun with a handful soon multiplied into thousands, then tens of thousands, until even Plutarch and Appian conceded that the rebel host at its peak may have numbered 70, perhaps even 80,000 strong. It was a staggering figure, yet it was not mere chaos. Under Spartacus's discipline and vision, these slaves were forged into an army with structure, with strategy. No longer desperate runaways, they learned how to seize provisions, craft weapons, ambush and defend. In battle after battle, Spartacus revealed a talent that rivaled Rome's seasoned commanders, perhaps even outshone them, for he was unbound by the rigid traditions of Roman warfare and free to fight with cunning innovation. The rebellion spilled across Campania, then into Apulia, turning fertile lands into battlegrounds. Roman detachments sent to crush them were annihilated, their arms, horses, and supplies seized by the rebels. To the poor, they looked like liberators, avengers of injustice. To the masters, they were a nightmare, a storm beyond control. And to the Senate, they were a humiliation without precedent. A mob of slaves, meant to die on the sands of the arena, now dared to challenge the Republic itself. Yet even as the whirlwind grew, cracks appeared within. What was their true aim? For many, the dream was simple: escape Rome's grasp. The idea of crossing the Alps and scattering back to their homelands, Gaul, Thrace, and beyond, to live as free men again, had irresistible allure. Spartacus himself seemed inclined toward this course, for he knew that the longer they remained in Italy, the more certain they would face the Republic's full military might, a contest they could not ultimately win. But not all agreed. Some leaders, most of all the Gaulish warrior Crixus, hungered to march on Rome itself. To them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to shame Rome at its heart. Among the rank and file, rage and the thirst for vengeance burned fiercely. Thus, two visions split the movement: flight to freedom or direct confrontation. And within this choice lay the seeds of unrest, planted at the very moment the rebellion stood at its height. Crixus broke away with his own force to follow his path. The cost was catastrophic. With tens of thousands of Gauls and Germans, he clashed with Roman legions and fell. News of his death struck the rebellion like a sword. Spartacus's comrade in arms, a symbol of strength and pride, lay broken on the battlefield. The loss shook the rebels to their core. But Spartacus refused to let despair consume them. According to Plutarch, he staged a grim memorial for Crixus. 300 Roman prisoners forced to fight to the death before the rebel host. It was vengeance, yes, but more than that, it was a declaration. If Rome had made them slaughter each other for amusement, now Romans would taste that same cruelty. In that macabre arena, the old order was overturned, a reversal so haunting that Roman historians shuddered to record it. The uprising did not falter. Spartacus led his forces to further victories, humiliating the Senate time and again. He appeared determined to steer his army northward, toward the Alps, toward freedom. Yet among the tens of thousands who followed him, not all were willing to abandon their chance for retribution. The ambition and fury of the multitude made the road uncertain. Spartacus, though their leader, could not always impose his will. From afar, the rebellion resembled a great wave, rising high, crashing with immense power, but wild and fragile. Spartacus rode atop it, striving to direct its course, but the larger the wave grew, the harder it was to master. With every triumph, the seeds of ruin were also sown, for Rome could not, and would not, endure this shame forever. The death of Crixus revealed the rebellion's fragility. Yet it also showed the fire Spartacus could breathe into his followers. He would not let defeat mark the end, but instead transformed it into fuel for fiercer resistance. And in the blaze of their continued victories, Spartacus and his slave army became a living nightmare for Rome. But such growth, from a handful of fugitives to a colossal host, finally forced the Senate's hand. Rome, conqueror of nations, now had to treat a slave army as a true enemy. And so the stage was set for the Republic's giants, Crassus and later Pompey, to step forward. In their clash with Spartacus, the rebellion would pass into history, etched as a tragic epic of blood and defiance. The years 72 to 71 BCE marked the turning point of the rebellion. Rome, after a long period of disdain, was finally forced to wake up and admit that Spartacus was no longer just leading a chaotic band of slaves. He had become a genuine threat, an enemy on par with the mighty armies that had once shaken the Republic to its core. And when Rome recognized someone as an equal adversary, it meant that the full force of the Republic would be unleashed. The Roman Senate, fractured as it was by endless political rivalries, came to a rare moment of agreement. The uprising had to be crushed at any cost. They called upon some of the greatest generals of the age, men who had already carved their names into the annals of war. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, was handed supreme command. Crassus had more than just money to fund his legions. He carried an insatiable political ambition that could only be realized through a decisive military triumph. He was given 8 legions, around 40,000 regular soldiers, a massive force, unlike anything a slave army had ever faced before. But Crassus was not alone. To the north, Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, one of Rome's rising young stars, was returning from his campaign in Spain. To the east, Lucullus, fresh from his victories against Mithridates, stood ready to intervene as well. The steel trap was closing in, from 3 sides, pushing Spartacus and his army deeper into the far south of Italy. At first, Spartacus still managed to win victories. His rebels, masters of guerrilla tactics and surprise strikes, continued to frustrate Roman legions. But Crassus was not like the bungling commanders Spartacus had humiliated before. He was hard, disciplined, and ruthless. When some of his legions faltered, Crassus unleashed one of Rome's most feared punishments, decimatio. 1 in every 10 soldiers of a disgraced unit was executed by their own comrades. This punishment, long abandoned as too brutal, was resurrected by Crassus as a bloody warning to his men, victory or death, and sometimes both. The cruelty worked. His troops became disciplined, terrifying, relentless. Slowly, they tightened their grip, pushing Spartacus southward, cutting off every escape. Spartacus understood that to remain trapped in Italy would mean annihilation. He sought another path, across the sea to Sicily. It was not a hopeless dream. Sicily had been the cradle of 2 great slave uprisings before. It was a fertile island, rich in resources, a place where Spartacus could regroup, feed his men, and perhaps turn the rebellion into a Mediterranean-wide movement. To achieve this, he turned to the Cilician pirates, infamous marauders of the sea, who plundered but also rented out their fleets to the highest bidder. With the treasure looted in campaigns past, Spartacus struck a deal. The pirates promised ships to ferry his men across the Strait of Messina into Sicily. But when the time came, the Cilicians betrayed him. They took the gold and vanished, leaving Spartacus and tens of thousands of rebels stranded on the shore, staring across a sea they could never cross. It was a bitter moment when the dream of escape dissolved like mist over the waves, when betrayal revealed the harsh truth. Slaves had no allies but themselves. Crassus seized the moment. He ordered the construction of vast fortifications, walls, trenches, and ditches stretching for miles, sealing the rebels inside the Bruttium Peninsula at the southern tip of Italy. Such a strategy was unprecedented in the war against slaves, proof of just how seriously Rome now regarded this enemy. Spartacus and his army were caged, pressed against the sea with nowhere left to run. And yet, even in despair, Spartacus did not surrender. He launched daring breakouts, smashing through Roman lines, searching desperately for escape routes. At times, he succeeded, but each breach was closed again. With every passing day, food dwindled, morale cracked, and the future darkened. The glorious victories of the past were fading into memory, replaced by a brutal struggle for survival, where every handful of grain, every horse, every scrap of weaponry became a question of life or death. But the cruelest blow did not come from Crassus. It came from the north, where Pompey was marching home from Spain with a hardened army. Spartacus knew, if he were caught between Crassus's discipline and Pompey's strength, all paths would close forever. On one side loomed the iron hand of Crassus, on the other, the shadow of Pompey falling fast across Italy. The rebellion stood on the knife's edge of destruction. With Crassus before him and Pompey behind, there was no escape left. Spartacus had only one choice: to fight to the end. And so the final reckoning drew near, on the banks of the river Silaris, where tens of thousands would fall, where the soil would be soaked in blood, and where the name of Spartacus would leave the realm of history and step into the realm of legend. In the spring of 71 BC, the wheel of fate turned to its most brutal point. After months on the run, after failed attempts to cross the sea, Spartacus and his army found themselves cornered with nowhere left to go. By then, he had only around 20 to 30,000 men at his side. A formidable force still, but a shadow of the 80,000 who had once followed him in the days of glory. Hungry, exhausted, and trapped in southern Italy, they prepared for the final clash against 40,000 disciplined Roman troops under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus. This was no longer the ragged militia of earlier encounters, but a war machine forged in iron discipline and terror. Crassus had shaped his soldiers through fear, punishment, and the promise of Rome's glory, molding them into men ready to kill or die without hesitation. Before Spartacus stood not just an army, but the might of a republic that would never again allow itself to be humiliated by slaves. According to the historian Appian, as the decisive battle drew near, Spartacus performed a gesture worthy of Greek tragedy. He brought his horse before the entire army, killed it with his own hands, and declared that if they triumphed, he would have the horses of the enemy to ride, but if they failed, he would no longer have need of one. It was his way of telling his men that there would be no retreat, no escape, only the fight to the bitter end. The clash unfolded on the banks of the river Silaris, in a lowland hemmed in by the hills of southern Italy. One can imagine the scene that morning: a sky heavy with clouds, the air so tense it could be cut with a blade. Then came the roar of voices, the ring of steel on steel, the frantic cries of horses, the deep, thunderous blare of Roman horns sounding the beginning of slaughter. Unlike many commanders who remained behind the lines, Spartacus hurled himself into the fray. Sword in hand, body scarred and bleeding, his eyes burned with fury. Appian recounts how he fought face to face, cutting down 2 Roman officers as he tried desperately to reach Crassus himself, seeking, it seemed, to strike off the head of the serpent and shatter the Roman host. But fate did not favor him. Gravely wounded, blood pouring from his body, he still fought on, swinging his blade until his strength failed and he collapsed, encircled by enemies. What followed was perhaps the most haunting detail. No one ever found his body. Among tens of thousands of corpses strewn across the field, neither friend nor foe could recover Spartacus. Perhaps he was buried under the anonymous dead, perhaps torn apart in the chaos, or perhaps, as later generations would imagine, it was destiny, that he would not be reduced to a corpse, but remain an immortal symbol. The Battle of the Silaris was a nightmare. Tens of thousands perished in a single day. The river ran red, the earth soaked with blood. The rebels fought with the desperation of men who knew their end had come, but they could not withstand the discipline and overwhelming might of Rome. Small groups were encircled, crushed, annihilated, until the vast army of Spartacus was no more. And yet, the horror did not end with the battle. Crassus, both to assert his dominance and to send a warning that would echo through history, ordered 6,000 captured rebels to be crucified along the Appian Way. the great road that linked Capua to Rome. Imagine it, mile after mile, stretching across hundreds of kilometers, every few paces a cross with a writhing body nailed upon it, screaming, groaning, slowly dying in agony. The road became an open graveyard, a ghastly warning to anyone who might dream of defying Rome. Merchants, travelers, soldiers, all were forced to pass through that corridor of death, carrying the terror deep into their hearts. It was both an end and a beginning. Crassus may have extinguished the flames, but he could not erase the embers. The cruelty of the crucifixions, the unspeakable vision of the Appian Way, ensured that Spartacus's rebellion became more than just a crushed revolt. Rome could boast of its victory, but hidden within that victory was shame. That it had taken 3 years and the greatest generals of the Republic to bring down an army of slaves. Spartacus's body vanished, but his name endured. In Roman memory, in the writings of historians, in the imagination of generations to come, he ceased to be merely a man. He became a symbol of resistance, of defiance that would not bend even in the face of death. And from that tragic dawn by the river Silarus, his story slipped free of time, free of Rome, and crossed into legend. The uprising of Spartacus ended in a sea of blood, but that defeat was far from meaningless. On the contrary, it shook Rome to its very core, forcing an empire that seemed untouchable to confront its own fragility. For 3 long years, a band of slaves and outcasts had thrown Rome into chaos, forcing the Senate to call upon its best generals, tens of thousands of trained soldiers, and vast sums of money to crush them. And though Rome proclaimed victory, the mere fact that such a rebellion had existed carved a deep crack into the myth of their invincibility. The Romans were notorious for their ruthlessness, yet even they knew fear, and that fear carried quiet consequences. There is no direct evidence that the Senate passed new laws to improve the lives of slaves in the aftermath, but from then on, attitudes shifted. Slave owners, haunted by the specter of revolt, were forced to reconsider the sheer weight of oppression they inflicted. The earlier uprisings in Sicily had felt distant, but Spartacus was a wound at the very heart of the Italian peninsula, a nightmare too close to Rome itself. In the wake of that terror, many landowners began hiring free laborers or softening conditions just enough to keep their slaves subdued. Rome, unconsciously, began to loosen its absolute dependence on slavery, not out of mercy, but out of fear. But fear was not the only legacy. There were also men who gained from Spartacus's fall. Crassus, who tightened the noose and ultimately crushed the rebel army, became a hero in the eyes of the Senate, even though his victory was soaked in blood and cruelty. Pompey, though late to the battlefield, seized much of the glory by cutting down the fleeing remnants and reporting back to Rome that he had ended the slave war. These 2 men, one rich, one prestigious, rode that triumph straight into the center of Roman politics. Alongside a young, ambitious Gaius Julius Caesar, they would form the first triumvirate, the alliance that would drive the Republic to its end and usher in the empire. In that sense, the death of Spartacus helped pave the way for some of the most fateful figures in world history. And yet, if Crassus and Pompey remain just names on Rome's endless list of generals, Spartacus transcends his own era. He is not confined to Roman history books, but has become a universal symbol, a timeless image. Strangely enough, this comes from the gaps in the record. Because we know so little about him, every generation, every movement, every culture has been able to project onto Spartacus the figure they needed. In the 18th century, when the Haitian Revolution erupted, enslaved black rebels saw in Spartacus a distant brother, proof that slaves could become warriors and break their chains. In the 19th century, revolutionaries and socialist philosophers across Europe hailed him as a symbol of class struggle, even calling him a primitive communist who dared to challenge an unjust system. By the 20th century in Germany, a radical group named themselves the Spartacists, borrowing his name to declare their resistance to oppression. And of course, in the modern world, popular culture transformed Spartacus into a cinematic legend. The 1960 film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas, became not only a Hollywood classic, but also a political statement in the Cold War era, when debates over freedom, oppression, and human rights echoed worldwide. The line, "I am Spartacus," as the slaves all stand to shield their leader, remains one of the most iconic moments in film history. It has been echoed in protest movements across the globe, from American streets to European squares. The power of Spartacus lies in the fact that he is more than a man. He is a mirror of humanity's longing for freedom. The poor peasant can see himself in Spartacus. The colonial slave sees himself in Spartacus. The struggling worker sees himself in Spartacus. And even the intellectual revolutionary sees in him an eternal ideal. Each era reshapes him in its own image. But at the core remains the same truth: defiance in the face of oppression, the insistence that even the weakest can rise against the mightiest. What makes him even more ethereal is the absence of his body. If there had been a tomb, a grave, a place to point and say, "Here lies Spartacus," perhaps he would have remained just another figure of history. But there was nothing. He vanished among the nameless dead, and because of that, he could be everywhere. Spartacus is not bound to a site or a monument, but exists as an immortal spirit in humanity's imagination. And so, from flesh and blood, Spartacus became an idea that transcends borders, languages, and centuries to whisper one eternal message: chains are never destiny, and even in defeat, the longing for freedom can live forever. That is why Spartacus's legacy does not lie in what he achieved on the battlefield. After all, he was defeated. It lies in the fact that his defeat has echoed louder than Rome's victory. The empire may have crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way, but those crosses did not bury Spartacus's memory. They only deepened Rome's image as cruel and made the flame of liberty burn even brighter. And it is precisely the gaps in history, the absence of detail, the emptiness surrounding the real man, that have turned him into legend. A void filled with imagination, with yearning, with the conviction that wherever there is oppression, there will be those who dare to rise. Spartacus, therefore, never truly belonged to the 1st century BC. He belongs to all of us, in every age. Spartacus is one of history's great paradoxes. We know almost nothing about him. No diaries, no speeches, no inscriptions bearing his name. Even his body vanished among the countless corpses left on the battlefield of Salaris. He survives only in scattered accounts written by his enemies, and in fragments of stories that feel more like symbols than truths. Yet, precisely because we know so little, we remember so much. That silence, that absence of detail, has become a canvas on which humanity has painted its imagination, transforming an unknown slave into one of the most immortal figures of the past. Think of the irony. A man born in distant Thrace, with no throne, no noble lineage, no Greek education, no Roman glory. Sold into slavery, thrown into the arena as nothing more than a bloodied plaything for the crowd, he should have perished in obscurity, forgotten like hundreds of thousands of other slaves. And yet, instead of being buried, he turned chains into swords, despair into fire, and came perilously close to bringing Rome to its knees. No one knows his face, no one knows his voice, and yet the name Spartacus has echoed across 2 millennia. Because Spartacus was never just a man. He became an idea. And that idea was simple, eternal. No chain can bind the human longing for freedom. The Romans could crucify 6,000 men along the Appian Way, turning the road itself into an open graveyard, but they could not crucify memory. They could crush the revolt, but they could not crush the power of its symbol. And so, the paradox endures. The defeated, the broken, the executed. He became the one who would never truly die in the memory of mankind. Spartacus was not a king founding a dynasty, not a general building an empire, not a philosopher writing immortal doctrines. He was a slave. But it was precisely that which made him greater than many who sat on thrones. For the death of a king is only the replacement of one power by another. The death of a slave who dares to defy that power becomes a message that endures forever. And so Spartacus steps beyond the 1st century BC, beyond the walls of Rome, beyond the writings of Plutarch and Appian, to enter the shared legend of humanity. He is the whisper behind the slave uprisings in the Caribbean, the banner in the hands of European revolutionaries, the name sung in the Spartacist movement of Berlin, the unyielding figure immortalized on Hollywood's silver screen. His death, which seemed like an ending, was in truth a beginning. Spartacus ceased to exist as flesh and blood, but he lived on as a symbol. And that symbol still whispers to us today. that in the deepest darkness of oppression, the brightest flame of freedom can ignite. Spartacus is gone, and yet Spartacus will never die.